We've got our form on the screen, and now we need to make sure that whenever it gets submitted, the user gets entered into our lottery contract. As you and I very well know by this point, when we say enter into the contract, we really mean send a transaction to the enter function on our lottery contract. That's what we're trying to do. So let's go back over to our code editor. Here's our form element. Let's add an event handler that watches for the submit event on the form. We'll then define that event handler and write some code in there to make sure that anytime this thing gets submitted, we call the appropriate function on the contract. So I'll say onSubmit equals this dot onSubmit. So you and I are going to make a function called onSubmit that's going to be used to actually call the lottery contract. Let's now go up outside the render method and we'll add that event handler in. So I'll say on enter like so. Or do we call it onSubmit? Did I just make, oops, sorry, onSubmit. My mistake. OnSubmit like so. Now, one thing to be aware of, whenever we are making use of an event handler with React, we always have to worry about the context of the function. And when I say context, I'm talking about the value of this. Traditionally, we have made use of techniques like calling this.onSubmit.bind this. However, with the version of Babel that is running inside the Create React App Starter Pack, we get another little benefit or another little piece of syntax to keep us from having to worry about manually binding the function. So rather than using this syntax right here to define onSubmit, we're going to use a slightly different syntax for defining this function. We're going to instead write out onSubmit equals and then an arrow function. So when we use this syntax right here, it's still defining a method on the class, but we don't have to worry about the value of this inside of the function, as we normally would with a method. The value of this will be automatically set for us to be equal to our component, which is exactly what we want. So we don't have to worry about binding onSubmit down in the render function. All right, so let's get back on track now. Whenever onSubmit gets called, it'll be called with an event object, and that event object represents the form submission. As usual, we want to make sure that the form does not attempt to submit itself in the classic HTML way. So we're going to start off by calling event.prevent default. Oops, default, like so. Then inside of here, we can start to write out the code to send a transaction to the enter function. That's definitely going to involve some asynchronous code, so I will be sure to mark this function as async, like so. Then we can start to write out the actual transaction. One thing that I want to mention before we write the transaction, a couple of videos ago, I had mentioned that whenever we are making calls in this sort of JavaScript React world that uses the provider from Web3, we don't have to make use of that from property and specify which account we are sending this transaction from. Now that is true with calls. However, with the version of Web3 that we are making use of here, unfortunately that is not true of sending transactions. So when we send a transaction, we unfortunately do have to retrieve our list of accounts from the Web3 object and then specify the account that is going to be used to send money over to that particular function that exists on our contract. So long story short, before directly calling the lottery contract send or enter method, we have to get a list of our accounts. Now we've gotten a list of our accounts in the past before. Recall that we can call const accounts await web3.eth.get accounts. So we did that just a little bit ago inside of the render method of our component. When we did it previously, we didn't make use of the async await syntax, but in this case, because we are in a function that is marked as async, there's no issue with taking that approach. All right, so now that we've got our list of accounts, we're going to assume that the first account inside this array is going to be the account that is going to be sending the transaction. So with that in mind, we can then write out the actual statement to enter our user into the lottery. So we'll say await lottery dot methods dot enter dot send. And then just as we are very used to by this point, we need to specify both a value property and the from property. So from is definitely going to be accounts at 0. Again, we are assuming that the first address inside of our list of accounts is the one that is going to be used to enter into the lottery. Then we're going to also specify the value property, which is going to be the amount of money that we want to enter into the lottery contract. So this is going to come from the property that we've been setting inside that input that we put together in the last video. So here's the input right here. The property that we care about is this.state.value. Remember that this right here is a value in ether. So we need to first convert this over to way before we send it into the transaction. So back at onSubmit, we're going to specify this.state.value, and we're going to make sure to convert that over to way. So in front of this, we'll put web3.utils.toWay. And then of course, as a second argument, we also need to specify what units this.state.value is using. And so that's going to be ether, like so. All right, so this is going to enter us into our contract. But as we said several videos ago, this is sending a transaction to the network, and that's going to be something that takes 15 to 30 seconds, or at least some amount of time. So we really want to provide some feedback to our user and tell them, hey, we're currently doing something for you. Like, we are entering you into this lottery. And then ideally, we should also send them a message that says something like, hey, you've now been entered after this function has been successfully executed. So I think that to add on this type of messaging thing to our user, we can make use of the state system inside of React again. So let's take a quick pause here. We'll come back in the next video and we'll start putting together a little piece of state message so we can communicate what's going on to our users.